For more than 300,000 years, Neanderthals endured across the vast landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. Their existence stretched through glacial advances and retreats, through forests thick with game and plains swept bare by icy winds. They were not fragile visitors in an unforgiving world. They were its native inhabitants, molded by the relentless pressure of the Ice Age into stocky, resilient bodies with barrel-shaped chests, powerful limbs, and the endurance to withstand climates that would test even the hardiest modern populations. Archaeological layers across Spain, France, Germany, the Levant, and Siberia revealed their deep time presence, evidence that for thousands of generations they were not an anomaly, but a dominant human lineage. And yet, around 40,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins to change with startling abruptness. The dense accumulation of Mousterian tools, hearths, and bones that testify to their long continuity grows thinner, then vanishes altogether. In its place, the material culture of Homo sapiens spreads rapidly across Europe. Within a geological instant, a species that had thrived for hundreds of millennia disappeared from the record. This sudden vanishing leaves a haunting silence in the earth, a puzzle that has drawn anthropologists, geneticists, and archaeologists into one of the deepest questions in human prehistory. Why did they disappear while we remained? The mystery is sharpened by the recognition that Neanderthals were not mindless brutes, as 19th-century caricatures suggested. Their cranial capacity was on par with, and sometimes larger than, our own. Their hands show the dexterity to produce tools with meticulous craftsmanship. They hunted large game cooperatively, controlled fire, cared for their injured, and buried their dead. Caves such as Shanidar in Iraq reveal skeletons with crippling injuries who nonetheless lived for years, suggesting social support and empathy. These were not creatures on the margins of cognition, but beings whose mental worlds may have been uncomfortably close to our own. And still, something separated survival from extinction. Fossil evidence demonstrates that anatomically modern humans entered Europe roughly 45,000 years ago, carrying with them new technologies and patterns of behavior. Within 5 millennia, an eye blink in evolutionary time, Neanderthal sites had all but vanished. Was their disappearance the inevitable outcome of competition with a species more adaptable, more innovative, or more socially complex? Or was it the result of climate instability, genetic fragility, or simple chance? Each hypothesis holds fragments of the answer, yet none alone provides the full picture. The enigma deepens when one turns to the emerging field of paleogenomics. In 2010, Svante Pääbo and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology sequenced the Neanderthal genome, revealing that modern non-African humans carry between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. This discovery shattered the idea of a clean replacement. Neanderthals did not simply vanish. Parts of them live on in us, influencing our immunity, metabolism, even aspects of our skin and hair. Their extinction, therefore, was not absolute erasure, but a complex blending, followed by demographic dominance of Homo sapiens. Yet this only sharpens the paradox. How could a lineage so intertwined with ours have disappeared as a distinct population? Anthropologists often speak of the knife edge of survival, on which Ice Age humans balanced. Small changes in fertility, mortality, or resource availability could determine whether a lineage expanded or dwindled. In this fragile arithmetic, Homo sapiens must have found some advantage that tilted the balance in their favor. But advantage can mean many things: the breadth of a diet, the complexity of a social network, the capacity for symbolic thought, or the ability to endure psychological strain. Survival is not merely a contest of strength or intelligence, but a test of adaptability across multiple dimensions: ecological, cultural, cognitive, and emotional. The haunting part of this story lies not just in their extinction, but in the fact that it could have been us. Archaeological layers in Africa and the Levant suggest that modern humans, too, once teetered on the brink of disappearance. Genetic bottleneck studies indicate that our ancestors may have dwindled to just a few thousand individuals during harsh climatic episodes around 70,000 years ago. In such a precarious context, the difference between vanishing and prevailing might rest on factors invisible to the archaeological record. A ritual practice that unified groups, a dietary expansion that reduced famine, or a psychological resilience that allowed them to withstand stress without fragmenting. Neanderthals, by contrast, seem to have been trapped in a cycle of continuity that ultimately left them vulnerable. They perfected the strategies that had sustained them for hundreds of millennia, yet when confronted with rapid changes, whether environmental shifts or the arrival of a competing species, they may have lacked the flexibility to adjust. Stability had become their strength, but also their weakness. Evolutionary biologists call this the Red Queen problem. Species must continually adapt, not just to gain advantage, but simply to avoid falling behind. The silence of their disappearance is therefore not a simple absence, but a presence of questions that cannot be resolved by bones alone. Each cave site, each stone tool, each genome fragment opens the possibility that extinction was not a matter of one decisive blow, but of accumulating disadvantages layered against the unforgiving mathematics of survival. And so, the puzzle remains. How a lineage that endured longer than our recorded history, that shaped the European landscape with its presence, and that even left echoes in our blood, came to vanish from the earth in so brief a span. The search for answers requires moving beyond bones and tools, into the deep interplay of climate, psychology, and social life, where subtle forces accumulate until the threshold of survival is crossed. And once crossed, it cannot be undone. The disappearance of Neanderthals cannot be disentangled from the world they inhabited, a world dominated by the cyclical violence of the Ice Age. Between 130,000 and 40,000 years ago, Europe and Western Asia oscillated between brief periods of relative warmth and long intervals of bitter cold. These fluctuations were not gradual but often abrupt, occurring within the span of a human lifetime. Ice cores from Greenland reveal sudden shifts in temperature of up to 10 degrees Celsius in less than a century, jolting ecosystems into instability. For those who depended on the land, such volatility meant that what was a forested valley in one generation could be a frozen steppe in the next. Neanderthals were physically sculpted for this environment. Their bodies were compact, minimizing surface area to conserve heat, with broad noses that may have warmed frigid air before it reached their lungs. Stable isotope analysis of their bones indicates a diet heavily reliant on large herbivores, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, reindeer, and bison that roamed the steppe tundra in vast herds. To track and kill such prey required not just strength, but the stamina to endure long hunts across open, wind-scoured plains. Archaeological sites, such as La Côte de Saint-Brelade on Jersey, contain the remains of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses driven into natural traps, evidence of collective strategy. Their survival was not haphazard, but deeply embedded in ecological mastery. Yet this mastery came with vulnerability. Dependence on large game created a precarious balance. When climatic oscillations altered migration routes or reduced herd sizes, the Neanderthals' specialized adaptation turned into a trap. Pollen analysis shows how quickly landscapes could shift from open grasslands, rich with grazing herds, to dense forests where large animals were scarce. Periods of ecological abundance were followed by sudden contractions, forcing groups into marginal habitats where survival strained against the limits of reproduction. Modern humans entering Europe were shaped by the same climate, yet their strategies reveal a different psychological flexibility. Faunal remains at early Homo sapiens sites include fish, birds, small mammals, and plant foods, indicating an ability to adjust subsistence patterns when large prey grew scarce. Neanderthals, by contrast, show little evidence of exploiting such alternatives on a significant scale. This divergence in resource use suggests not just a difference in tools, but a deeper difference in perception. The capacity to conceptualize varied food sources, to experiment, and to modify cultural practices in response to sudden scarcity. Climatic instability did not only dictate what could be eaten, but also how groups organized their lives. The shifting mosaic of environments fragmented territories, forcing bands to adapt to constant change. Genetic evidence indicates that Neanderthal groups were often small and relatively isolated, surviving in patches of favorable habitat, separated by long distances of inhospitable terrain. Such fragmentation amplified the risks of inbreeding, bottlenecks, and local extinction events. The Ice Age did not offer a stable backdrop against which human species could play out their differences. It was itself an active agent, shaping the fates of those who struggled within it. Psychological resilience under these conditions may have been as important as physical endurance. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups emphasize the mental toll of unpredictability, the anxiety of uncertain resources, the strain of repeated dislocation, the social pressures when cooperation falters under stress. Evidence from stress markers in Neanderthal teeth, visible as enamel hypoplasia, reveals episodes of malnutrition and illness during childhood, likely tied to environmental shocks. Such interruptions in growth are not mere biological scars, but windows into lives lived on the edge of sufficiency, where survival was not guaranteed from one season to the next. The landscapes themselves would have reinforced this tension. Imagine the glacial front advancing across northern Europe, grinding valleys beneath walls of ice hundreds of meters high, pushing populations southward into refuges along the Mediterranean and the Caucasus. Behind the ice stretched tundra plains populated with massive herds, but also stalked by saber-toothed cats and cave lions. Winters could last 9 months, and even in summers, frosts returned without warning. To survive here required not only strength, but an ability to anticipate change, to interpret the smallest shifts in weather, animal movement, and plant growth as signals of what was to come. Archaeological residues suggest that Neanderthals endured these cycles with remarkable persistence. Yet the cost of persistence grows invisible until populations collapse. To live for hundreds of thousands of years in such conditions meant constant exposure to risk that compounded with every sudden climate shock. A lineage can endure repeated stresses until one more oscillation, one more contraction of resources, tips the balance beyond recovery. And still, the puzzle lingers. If Neanderthals were so attuned to Ice Age Europe, why were they the ones to vanish when modern humans arrived into the same landscapes? Was the very stability of their adaptation the factor that left them brittle to change? Did the Ice Age, with its relentless unpredictability, favor not those most specialized for the cold, but those most willing to break habits and try the unfamiliar? These questions hang unresolved, leading toward deeper layers of vulnerability that are not recorded in stone tools alone, but in the fragile arithmetic of small populations scattered across a continent that never ceased shifting beneath their feet. The harshness of Ice Age climates did more than reshape landscapes. It compressed populations into pockets of survival, fracturing communities into small, dispersed groups. For Neanderthals, this fragmentation became an invisible but persistent threat, Genetic studies of Neanderthal remains, such as those from Vindija Cave in Croatia and Denisova Cave in Siberia, reveal low levels of genetic diversity compared with modern humans. Where Homo sapiens genomes exhibit broad variability, reflecting large interconnected populations, Neanderthals display signs of long-term isolation. Reduced heterozygosity, an indicator of limited genetic mixing, suggests that many groups lived in demographically fragile conditions, where even modest losses could not be replenished. Small population size is not merely a matter of numbers. It alters the very mathematics of survival. In demography, the concept of minimum viable population describes the threshold below which random fluctuations in birth and death rates can trigger collapse. For species living at the edge of ecological sufficiency, chance alone can determine persistence. A severe winter that reduces prey, an outbreak of disease, or a conflict with neighboring bands could decimate a group so thoroughly that recovery became improbable. In larger populations, such fluctuations are buffered by sheer scale. For Neanderthals, dispersed across a patchwork of refuges and valleys, the buffer was thin. Inbreeding magnified these risks. Genetic analyses from a Neanderthal individual, found in Denisova Cave, reveal signatures of close kin mating, possibly half-siblings or other close relatives. Such patterns were likely not exceptional, but a structural feature of isolated groups. Inbreeding reduces genetic diversity further, increasing the expression of harmful recessive traits, compromising fertility, and weakening immune responses. The resilience of a population depends not only on its size, but on its genetic toolkit for adaptation. Neanderthals carried fewer tools in this sense, leaving them exposed to pressures that required rapid physiological or immunological shifts. Archaeological traces provide glimpses of how small these groups could be. Many Neanderthal sites, from caves in Iberia to shelters in the Caucasus, contain hearths and living spaces that suggest communities of perhaps 10 to 20 individuals. Extended families, rather than larger bands, appear to have formed the nucleus of their social structure. Such intimacy could foster cohesion and care, yet it limited the scale of cooperation. When resources failed or threats loomed, small groups lacked the manpower to sustain losses or mount large-scale efforts. The ability to split into subgroups, merge with outsiders, or exchange mates was constrained by geography and by the scarcity of neighboring populations. By contrast, the archaeological footprint of Homo sapiens from the same period often indicates larger, more fluid networks. Sites such as Blombos Cave in South Africa and later Upper Paleolithic settlements in Europe display evidence of symbolic communication and long-distance exchange, suggesting that small bands were connected into broader alliances. Genetic flow across these alliances maintained diversity, while also providing a social safety net in times of scarcity. Neanderthals, bound into smaller, more isolated clusters, may have found fewer lifelines when misfortune struck. Psychological and cultural consequences followed from this demographic reality. In small groups, innovation is harder to sustain. Anthropologist Robert Boyd has shown through models of cultural evolution that the maintenance of complex technologies requires a critical population size. Otherwise, knowledge decays as errors accumulate faster than they can be corrected. In isolated Neanderthal bands, even if an individual stumbled upon a useful innovation, the odds of it spreading widely were slim. A technique might vanish with the death of its originator, leaving no trace in the archaeological record. Modern humans, operating in denser networks, had greater capacity for cumulative culture, an advantage that compounded across generations. The fragile scale of Neanderthal groups also heightened vulnerability to psychological strain. In small populations, every injury or death reverberates, magnifying grief and reducing labor capacity. The loss of a skilled hunter or toolmaker could destabilize an entire band. Modern anthropological studies of small, isolated groups show how stress, resource uncertainty, and interpersonal tensions can spiral when options for social diffusion are limited. For Neanderthals, such spirals may have been common, invisible stressors etched into their demographic decline. Even migration carried risks. When populations are small, moving into new territories is not simply exploration, but dispersal that can permanently split a lineage. Genetic studies indicate that some Neanderthal groups reached as far east as Siberia. Yet these expansions did not knit into a robust web of connectivity. Instead, they may have stretched populations thinner, scattering fragile communities across immense distances without the density required for long-term resilience. In paleontological terms, small population size often leaves no dramatic fossil signature. Extinction can occur not as a cataclysm, but as a slow thinning, a quiet dwindling until absence replaces presence. For Neanderthals, this thinning may have begun long before modern humans entered Europe, a long demographic weakening that made them susceptible to being overshadowed by a species whose populations were larger, more connected, and more resilient to shocks. The weight of this fragility grows clearer when considered against the backdrop of Ice Age volatility. Each climatic oscillation amplified the risk that an already small group would vanish, leaving fewer and fewer strongholds across the continent. As the numbers dwindled, the chance of recovery slipped further from reach, until survival became a matter not just of adaptation, but of statistical improbability. And yet, the presence of Homo sapiens complicated this fragile equilibrium even further. Where survival already strained against demographic mathematics, new competition introduced variables that magnified pressure. The question then shifts from the vulnerabilities of small populations to the contested spaces in which two human species vied for the same prey, the same land, and the same fragile margin between persistence and disappearance. Scarcity sharpened the contest between Neanderthals and the expanding bands of Homo sapiens, and nowhere was the struggle more immediate than in the pursuit of food. Across Ice Age Europe, large mammals were the most coveted prize. Mammoths lumbering. Across the plains, herds of bison and reindeer migrating with the seasons, aurochs pressing into forest edges. These animals carried immense caloric rewards, but also carried immense risks. Both human lineages depended on them, and in territories where the herds were limited, the overlap of hunting grounds could transform necessity into conflict. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the intensity of this dependence. At Neanderthal sites such as La Borde in France, deposits of horse bones reveal mass kills orchestrated through group hunts, the carcasses dismembered with precision stone tools. Cut marks on mammoth remains in places like La Côte de Saint-Brelade suggest deliberate strategies of driving animals into ravines, an act requiring cooperation and planning. These practices reveal a species that understood its prey and coordinated to extract the maximum yield. But such methods were resource-intensive. They demanded collective energy, favorable terrain, and repeated success. When herds shifted routes, due to climate variability, these strategies faltered, and groups left behind faced starvation. Homo sapiens, while also targeting large mammals, displayed a strikingly different pattern of subsistence breadth. Sites associated with early modern humans in Europe and the Levant reveal bones of smaller animals, hares, birds, even tortoises, alongside remains of fish and evidence of plant processing. Isotope analysis of early human remains indicates a more varied diet, reflecting a willingness to exploit multiple food webs. Where Neanderthals concentrated effort on the great herds, modern humans diversified. This was not merely opportunism, but a form of ecological buffering. When one resource failed, others softened the blow. This contrast in dietary flexibility reveals a deeper cognitive divergence. Specialization requires mastery, but generalization requires imagination, the ability to perceive potential food sources not as they are immediately given, but as they could be transformed. Catching a hare requires snares or swift pursuit. Gathering shellfish requires the foresight to exploit tidal rhythms. Fishing requires lines, hooks, or nets. Each of these strategies embodies innovation layered upon observation, turning marginal resources into reliable supplements. Archaeological evidence from South African sites, such as Pinnacle Point, though earlier than the Neanderthal extinction, demonstrates that Homo sapiens had long integrated marine resources into their diets, a precedent for the adaptability later seen in Ice Age Europe. The psychological implications are striking. To survive on large game alone demands resilience and cooperation, but it also ties a group's fate to forces beyond control. To broaden the diet requires experimentation, risk-taking, and a willingness to adapt cultural practices in unfamiliar directions. These are traits deeply tied to cognition, flexibility, abstraction, and symbolic thinking. By diversifying food strategies, Homo sapiens may have cultivated not just survival advantages, but psychological ones, reinforcing habits of innovation that echoed through other domains of life. Competition extended beyond what was eaten to how food was distributed. Ethnographic parallels among modern hunter-gatherers suggest that sharing practices are central to group cohesion. Larger and more varied food stores allow for wider sharing networks, smoothing inequalities between successful and unsuccessful hunts. If modern humans could pool resources more effectively across larger groups, their survival buffer extended beyond immediate kin. For Neanderthals, constrained by smaller populations and narrower diets, such buffering was more limited. The absence of surplus reduces generosity to necessity, tightening the margins of cooperation. Archaeological cut marks on animal bones hint at another layer of competition: violence surrounding access to prey. Some Neanderthal remains, such as those at Saint-Césaire in France, bear trauma consistent with weapon injuries. While interpretation remains debated, the possibility of clashes over hunting territories underscores the precariousness of shared landscapes. When food equates to survival, competition between lineages is not abstract. It is written into the wounds on bones. Pathological evidence in Neanderthal skeletons also suggests the hazards of their hunting strategies. Many remains show healed fractures, particularly in the upper body, resembling injuries sustained by modern rodeo riders. This has led researchers to hypothesize that Neanderthals often killed prey at close range, thrusting heavy spears into massive animals. The cost of such methods was high. A single miscalculation could result in crippling injury. By contrast, Homo sapiens increasingly relied on projectile weapons that allowed distance between hunter and prey. This shift not only reduced risk, but opened avenues for targeting smaller, faster animals, further widening dietary scope. The significance of this divergence extends beyond calories. A diet shapes physiology and cognition alike. Nutritional diversity strengthens immune systems, supports reproductive health, and fuels brain function. A diet narrowly centered on red meat may sustain strength, but limits flexibility in times of scarcity. A varied diet not only provides stability, but fosters the exploration of new environments. When modern humans entered Europe, their adaptability to multiple niches gave them access to resources that Neanderthals either ignored or lacked the means to exploit. Yet even as dietary strategies reveal contrasts, the archaeological record does not speak with a single voice. Evidence exists of Neanderthals gathering plants, using medicinal herbs, and perhaps even cooking grains. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, pollen residues suggest the deliberate placement of flowers with the dead, though interpretations remain contested. These traces complicate the picture, hinting at capacities that may have approached those of Homo sapiens. But traces alone cannot erase the broader pattern. Neanderthal dependence on large game and the narrower subsistence strategies that amplified their vulnerability. What remains unresolved is how often these differences in diet brought the two species into direct confrontation. Did Neanderthals and modern humans encounter one another at kill sites, competing over carcasses in landscapes already stripped by climate? Did overlapping ranges force them into tense coexistence, where each successful hunt by one group meant deprivation for the other? The archaeological record leaves silences here, silences that suggest not absence, but erasure by time, where evidence of struggle has long since dissolved into the soil. The contest for food was never neutral. It was a zero-sum struggle for calories, territory, and the continuity of lineages. And once the margins of survival narrowed, the advantage lay not with those strongest in the hunt, but with those most capable of transforming scarcity into opportunity. From this point onward, competition began to take on a technological dimension, where survival hinged not only on what was hunted, but on the tools used to achieve it, tools that would alter the balance of power in profound ways. In the contest for survival, tools became silent arbiters of advantage. Every fragment of flint, every shaped blade, was not only a physical object, but also an extension of cognition, a crystallization of thought into matter. For Neanderthals, the Mousterian tradition defined much of their technological world. Characterized by the Levallois technique, this method involved carefully preparing a stone core so that flakes of predetermined shape could be struck from it. The skill required was considerable. Flakes were detached in calculated sequence, and the resulting tools, scrapers, points, denticulates, were versatile in hunting and butchering. Across hundreds of millennia, this technological repertoire remained stable, a testimony to its efficiency, but also to its inertia. Modern humans entering the same landscapes carried with them a markedly different toolkit. Blade technology, appearing in the Upper Paleolithic, relied on elongated flakes struck from cylindrical cores, producing sharper edges and more cutting surface per unit of raw material. These blades could be transformed into composite tools, hafted onto wooden shafts with adhesives such as birch tar or plant resin, sometimes reinforced with sinew bindings. Microscopic analysis of wear patterns shows that these tools were used not only for hunting, but also for working hides, carving bone, and shaping wood. Each refinement multiplied utility, extending the reach of human adaptability. Projectile technology marked an even greater divergence. Neanderthal spears, such as those discovered at Schöningen in Germany, reveal impressive craftsmanship. Straight wooden shafts, carefully balanced for thrusting at close range. Yet, they lacked aerodynamic design for long-distance flight. Hunting with such weapons meant proximity, a high-risk encounter between hunter and prey. Homo sapiens, by contrast, developed lighter projectiles, atlatl-thrown darts, and eventually, bow and arrow systems that enabled hunting at a distance. This shift not only reduced injury, but expanded the spectrum of accessible prey, allowing humans to target smaller, faster animals with efficiency. The innovation gap was not absolute. Neanderthals occasionally produced adhesive compounds and may have hafted points, evidence of technological sophistication. At sites like Campitello in Italy, residues of birch tar on stone tools suggest knowledge of controlled heating processes to extract sticky resins, a practice requiring an understanding of transformation through fire. Yet these moments of ingenuity appear sporadic, not widely diffused across populations. In modern human groups, by contrast, innovations spread across vast networks, carried along by symbolic communication and reinforced through cumulative transmission. A new technique discovered in one valley could, within generations, appear hundreds of kilometers away, its replication secured by the scaffolding of culture. The pace of innovation becomes visible in the archaeological record. With the arrival of Homo sapiens, artifact diversity accelerates. Bone needles, ornaments, engraved symbols, and tailored clothing emerge alongside increasingly sophisticated weapons. Each development reflects not just functional necessity, but a cognitive leap. The capacity to imagine objects that do not yet exist, to refine them iteratively, and to embed them within cultural identity. Archaeologists often speak of this as the ratchet effect. Once a tool or practice is created, it is preserved and built upon, preventing cultural regression. In Neanderthal populations, smaller and more fragmented, the ratchet slipped. Useful techniques appeared but often disappeared again, lost when their bearers perished, or when isolation prevented wider diffusion. Tools were not merely instruments, they reshaped social organization. The production of composite weapons required cooperation, collecting resin, shaping shafts, attaching stone points, and their maintenance demanded shared skill. In this sense, innovation structured human interactions, embedding technological knowledge into collective memory. Neanderthals, with fewer individuals per group, carried less redundancy. If a skilled napper died, expertise could vanish with them. In larger human groups, redundancy created resilience, ensuring that knowledge persisted across generations, even when individuals were lost. The psychological dimension of tool use cannot be overlooked. Experiments with stone napping in cognitive archaeology reveal that advanced flake production engages planning regions of the prefrontal cortex, requiring anticipation, sequencing, and working memory. The Levallois technique demonstrates Neanderthals possessed these abilities, yet the relative stasis of their technological repertoire suggests constraints in innovation cycles. Modern humans, perhaps through symbolic culture, reinforced innovation, with social prestige, embedding it into ritual, teaching, and identity. When objects carried meaning beyond utility, they became vessels of continuity, guarded and transmitted with intensity. The archaeological layering of tools reveals a rhythm of survival, but also a rhythm of imagination. Each blade and projectile carried implications beyond the hunt. It altered risk profiles, shaped group dynamics, and influenced demographic stability. A spear thrust at close range bound survival to strength and courage, while a dart thrown from a distance spread risk across the group, protecting hunters from lethal injury. Over generations, these small differences in risk accumulated, compounding into survival advantages that numbers alone cannot fully capture. Yet the archaeological record does not whisper the full story. Between Mousterian tools and Upper Paleolithic blades lies a chasm not only of technology, but of cognition and transmission. The puzzle remains unresolved. Why did Neanderthals, capable of sophisticated craftsmanship, not progress further along the path of sustained innovation? Was it the fragility of small populations, the absence of symbolic reinforcement, or differences in neurological wiring? The bones and tools do not yield clear answers, but they point to a divergence that would deepen as symbolic expression became inseparable from survival, pushing technological progress into the realm of culture itself. The trajectory of tools was inseparable from the symbolic worlds in which they were embedded. Material culture is never only about survival. It reflects how cognition and imagination refract through objects. In Neanderthal sites, there are glimpses, faint, yet undeniable, that they too engaged in symbolic behavior. At sites such as Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, perforated shells stained with pigments suggest adornment, perhaps worn as ornaments. At Grotta du Reno in France, bone tools and pendants have been interpreted as evidence of symbolic craft, though debates persist about whether these artifacts represent independent Neanderthal innovation or influence from nearby modern humans. These traces resist easy interpretation, but they open the possibility that Neanderthals inhabited symbolic dimensions of thought, if only intermittently. Homo sapiens, by contrast, left a far denser record of symbolic activity. Cave paintings at Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira display not just animals, but carefully arranged compositions, some enhanced with natural contours of rock, others layered with abstract signs. Hand stencils, dots, spirals, and engraved lines recur across continents, suggesting a shared inclination toward abstraction. The symbolic explosion in early modern humans did not merely produce art, it produced systems of meaning that reinforced cooperation and extended memory. Ritual objects, body decoration, and ornamentation were not luxuries but cognitive tools, binding groups through shared identity. The functional consequences of symbolism are often underestimated. Anthropologist David Lewis Williams argued that symbolic culture enabled the construction of social glue, rituals, and myths that coordinated large groups beyond the limits of face-to-face kinship. In small Neanderthal bands, trust may have been maintained through direct familiarity, but such intimacy limited scale. Homo sapiens could construct identities rooted in symbols, myths, and shared stories, expanding cooperation beyond immediate kin. The difference between 20 individuals bound by blood and 200 individuals bound by shared ritual could determine survival when resources tightened or conflicts arose. Symbolism also altered time perception. Through symbolic marks and objects, humans externalized memory, creating durable records of thought that extended beyond individual lifespans. Engravings on bone or ochre may appear simple, yet they represent the crystallization of abstract ideas into matter. This externalization allowed knowledge to accumulate, anchoring innovation across generations. Without such anchors, information is vulnerable to decay. Oral memory alone in fragile populations cannot guarantee continuity. The archaeological silence of consistent symbolic expression among Neanderthals may reflect not incapacity, but demographic fragility, where symbolic systems, once formed, withered before they could spread. The relationship between symbolism and altered states of consciousness also bears weight. Many cave paintings are located deep within chambers, accessible only through dangerous journeys into darkness. Ethnographic parallels suggest that such environments were often linked to trance states, ritual chants, and sensory deprivation, experiences that dissolve boundaries between self and group. These altered states reinforce cooperation, binding communities through shared visions and narratives. If Homo sapiens harnessed trance, rhythm, and ritualized symbolism, they possessed psychological tools for scaling trust far beyond the capacity of intimate bands. The role of these practices in survival is not mystical, but profoundly pragmatic. Collective trance sustains cohesion when scarcity or conflict threatens to fracture unity. Neanderthals, though not devoid of symbolic traces, seem to have engaged less systematically with such practices. The absence of widespread symbolic artifacts could suggest either different cultural priorities or cognitive constraints in embedding meaning consistently into material life. The possibility that symbolic systems flickered in and out of existence among them raises questions about cultural transmission. Without the redundancy of large interconnected populations, Rituals and symbols may have dissolved with each disrupted group, leaving only scattered hints in the record. The implications extend to how conflict was managed. Symbolic culture provides not just cohesion within groups, but also markers of distinction between groups. Ornaments, body paint, and rituals signal membership, delineating allies from outsiders. Such signals can reduce the costs of interaction by clarifying friend from foe, but they can also sharpen boundaries that make conflict more likely. In either case, symbolism transforms social landscapes, introducing layers of complexity absent in communities reliant only on direct familiarity. For Neanderthals, who lived in smaller and more isolated groups, these dynamics may never have scaled to the same degree, leaving them without the same buffer against the stresses of competition. The cognitive weight of symbolism is also reflected in neurological studies. Brain imaging of modern humans engaged in symbolic tasks, language, music, art, shows activation of distributed networks linking the prefrontal cortex, temporal lobes, and limbic structures. Such integration fosters creativity, emotional resonance, and social bonding. If Neanderthals shared some of these capacities but engaged them less consistently, the difference may have been less about raw cognition than about feedback loops of culture reinforcing neural pathways. A practice repeated, celebrated, and ritualized alters both the brain and the society that sustains it. What lingers unresolved is how close Neanderthals came to crossing the same symbolic threshold. Were their ornaments isolated experiments or remnants of a broader, now lost cultural world? Did demographic fragility erase what symbolic complexity they achieved, leaving only fragments for archaeologists to puzzle over? The silence of the record leaves the question hanging, yet the consequences are clear. Where one lineage embedded survival into ritual and symbol, the other remained more tethered to immediate strategies, leaving a subtle but widening gap. And once the difference between symbolic abundance and symbolic scarcity took root, its effects rippled outward into networks of exchange, transforming not just how groups thought, but how they connected across distance and time. Symbolic culture did not exist in isolation. It intertwined with the ways groups stretched beyond their immediate environment to form webs of exchange. Archaeological traces from the Upper Paleolithic reveal objects that had traveled vast distances. Shells from Mediterranean coasts discovered far inland. Obsidian transported hundreds of kilometers from its volcanic sources. Pigments exchanged between valleys. These were not random scatterings of material, but evidence of structured interaction, of networks that bound communities into larger spheres of reciprocity. For Homo sapiens, such networks provided profound survival benefits. Long-distance exchange allowed groups to buffer local shortages by tapping into resources from elsewhere. When prey animals migrated unpredictably, or when raw material for tool-making was scarce, trade provided alternatives. More importantly, networks transmitted not only goods but also knowledge. A technique for hafting, a new form of ornament, or a symbolic practice could diffuse across populations, preserved and refined in the process. The cumulative weight of these exchanges created a cultural momentum that amplified innovation and resilience. In contrast, the archaeological record of Neanderthals points to far more localized lifeways. While they transported stone raw materials across tens of kilometers, the distances pale against the hundreds traversed by modern humans. Isolated finds of marine shells at Neanderthal sites suggest occasional forays into symbolic exchange. Yet, the scale appears modest. Genetic data supports this picture of fragmentation. Neanderthal populations were regionally distinct, with limited flow between groups. Where Homo sapiens knitted themselves into continent-spanning webs, Neanderthals remained more tethered to local landscapes, their connections attenuated by distance and by the challenges of Ice Age geography. The psychological dimensions of these differences are as significant as the material ones. Networks require trust between strangers, mediated by symbols, rituals, and shared identities. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherers illustrate how exchange rituals often carry a ceremonial dimension, gift-giving, dances, feasts, that transform transactions into bonds. These practices embed social memory across generations, ensuring that obligations are remembered and cooperation extended even beyond kin. For Neanderthals, smaller groups and limited symbolic reinforcement may have constrained such expansions, keeping cooperation within the bounds of immediate familiarity. The flow of raw materials offers a window into these contrasts. At human sites in Central Europe, obsidian tools trace back to sources hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of sustained interaction networks. The circulation of ochre, often used for body painting or symbolic marking, likewise indicates a demand that exceeded local availability, reinforcing the role of color and ritual in shared identity. In Neanderthal contexts, raw materials are usually sourced locally, suggesting a narrower radius of movement and exchange. This does not imply incapacity, but reflects differences in social structuring. Neanderthals may not have required the same long-distance scaffolding, but the absence of such scaffolding left them more vulnerable to isolation. Networks also altered the dynamics of conflict. Larger, interconnected human groups could muster alliances that shifted the balance of power in contested landscapes. A band under threat might call upon distant allies, bonded through exchange and ritual, to resist competitors. Neanderthals, bound to smaller groups, lacked such reach. Conflict in their world may have been fought at the scale of family bands, with no reinforcements beyond the immediate horizon. The implications for survival, when confronted by expanding Homo sapiens, are stark. The neurological underpinnings of network building may also carry weight. The capacity for symbolic thought, language, and ritualized cooperation provided humans with the cognitive architecture to sustain relationships across absence. A bead or pendant exchanged between groups is more than decoration. It is a portable memory of alliance, a reminder that bonds persist even when individuals are apart. In evolutionary terms, such reminders externalize trust, enabling cooperation beyond the here and now. For Neanderthals, whose symbolic artifacts appear rarer, this scaffolding of memory may have been thinner, limiting the durability of distant ties. Yet, the archaeological silence does not mean complete absence. Some Neanderthal sites, such as those in Iberia, show signs of pigment use and possible ornamentation, raising the possibility that exchange networks flickered in some regions. But without the demographic density to reinforce them, such networks may have collapsed under stress, leaving only scattered hints. The contrast with Homo sapiens remains: a lattice of connections robust enough to span continents versus fragile threads stretched thin across local landscapes. The consequences of networks extended into reproduction as well. Larger interaction spheres increase the flow of mates, reducing inbreeding and bolstering genetic diversity. For small Neanderthal populations, the absence of such connectivity reinforced demographic fragility. Each isolated group faced the risks of genetic bottleneck, while Homo sapiens, through their networks, maintained variation that strengthened resilience against disease and environmental change. In this sense, networks were not just social constructs, but biological lifelines. What is most striking is how invisible these dynamics can be until one considers their cumulative force. No single exchange, no single alliance determines the fate of a species. But over generations, the difference between fragile local ties and robust continental webs compounds, shaping the capacity to absorb shocks, adapt, and persist. Networks, transformed vulnerability into opportunity, binding individuals into communities larger than themselves and embedding survival into the very fabric of relationship. The widening gulf between fragile isolation and expansive connectivity was not static. It unfolded in landscapes where resources, territories, and survival overlapped. When two human species shared the same ground, networks did not merely provide support. They altered the balance in encounters that could escalate from competition to confrontation. When two species share overlapping landscapes, their coexistence is never neutral. Archaeological traces across Europe suggest that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did not merely live in parallel, but intersected in contested environments where food, shelter, and territory converged. The nature of these encounters remains elusive, yet bones and artifacts whisper of tension that could spill into confrontation. At several Neanderthal sites, skeletal remains show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence. The cranium from Saint-Césaire in France, for instance, exhibits a depression fracture likely caused by a blunt weapon. Another, from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, bears penetrating wounds suggestive of projectile injury. While violence within Neanderthal groups cannot be excluded, the timing of some injuries coincides with periods of Homo sapiens' expansion into Europe, raising the possibility that at least some traumas were inflicted during clashes with incoming populations. Weaponry itself hints at shifting dynamics. Neanderthals fought with thrusting spears, formidable at close range, but demanding physical strength and proximity. Homo sapiens introduced projectiles that could be launched from a distance, whether through spear throwers or eventually bows. This technological asymmetry altered the cost of conflict. Neanderthals, forced into dangerous proximity, bore higher risks of injury, while humans could inflict harm with relative safety. Over repeated encounters, such imbalances would have accumulated into demographic consequences, reducing Neanderthal numbers while preserving human ones. Territorial overlap further intensified potential friction. Paleo-environmental reconstructions show that both species favored ecotonal zones, landscapes where forests met open plains, rich in prey diversity. These were the same zones that shifted most dramatically with climate oscillations, compressing populations into smaller refuges. As glaciers advanced and suitable habitats contracted, the likelihood of contact rose. Archaeologists studying sites in the Levant, such as Kebera and Kafze caves, have found alternating layers of Neanderthal and modern human occupation, suggesting waves of displacement and reoccupation. These stratigraphic patterns reveal not peaceful coexistence, but dynamic competition, where one group supplanted the other, sometimes repeatedly, as climates oscillated. Psychological factors may also have played a role in shaping conflict. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that competition for resources often triggers boundary defense behaviors, with groups responding aggressively to incursions. Symbolic culture among Homo sapiens amplified such behaviors by delineating group identity through ornaments, rituals, and markings. Outsiders could be recognized at a glance, transforming encounters into moments of heightened tension. Neanderthals, lacking extensive symbolic signaling, may have relied on direct familiarity rather than emblematic markers, leaving them at a disadvantage when confronting groups that defined identity through material and ritual display. Archaeological hints of cannibalism among both Neanderthals and early modern humans further complicate interpretations of encounters. At sites like Moulin-Guercy in France, Neanderthal bones exhibit cut marks consistent with butchery, while human remains at Krapina in Croatia show similar patterns. Whether these acts were driven by starvation, ritual, or hostility remains debated, but the presence of such evidence underscores the intensity of survival pressures. In contexts where calories were scarce and group identity sharply drawn, violence could escalate into practices that blurred the line between sustenance and symbolic. Aggression. The demographic consequences of conflict become clearer when considered against population size. Even minor skirmishes, if repeated, could devastate small Neanderthal groups. A handful of deaths in a band of 20 might erase its reproductive future, while losses in larger human groups could be absorbed. Archaeological absence in certain regions may not reflect gradual decline alone, but sudden erasure, where a group was extinguished in confrontation and its territory swiftly repopulated by competitors. Yet not all encounters need have been hostile. Genetic evidence demonstrates interbreeding, proving that moments of intimacy, alliance, or assimilation occurred. But such exchanges did not erase the broader reality of competition. In evolutionary landscapes, coexistence often contains within it the seeds of displacement, where one lineage outpaces the other not through a single decisive conflict, but through the cumulative weight of many small advantages, each magnified when populations clash. The unresolved question remains how often these encounters tipped into violence and how much violence mattered relative to other pressures. The bones bear scars, but silence surrounds the frequency of such scars. Archaeology preserves only fragments, leaving scholars to reconstruct the rhythms of conflict from traces that resist certainty. Yet in these gaps lies an unsettling possibility. That extinction was not solely ecological or demographic, but also written in wounds inflicted by the hands of another human species. And once violence became part of the equation, it could never be neatly contained. The same landscapes that nourished survival also staged confrontations, whose outcomes reshaped population trajectories, leaving behind not just bones, but the shadow of erasure that no tool or symbol could reverse. Encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not only marked by competition and violence, they also left evidence of intimacy. The most compelling testimony lies within our own genomes. When Svante Pääbo and colleagues sequenced the Neanderthal genome in 2010, they discovered that modern non-African humans carry between 1 and 4% of Neanderthal DNA. This revelation demonstrated that contact between the species was not strictly antagonistic. Sexual unions occurred often enough to leave enduring legacies, interweaving lineages in ways invisible until modern genetics uncovered them. The patterns of this admixture suggest that interbreeding took place repeatedly across different regions. Analyses of DNA from modern Eurasian populations reveal distinct Neanderthal contributions, implying multiple episodes of genetic exchange. These unions were not fleeting anomalies, but recurrent interactions across thousands of years. They may have occurred in moments of alliance, abduction, assimilation, or pragmatic merging of groups under stress. The motivations remain opaque, but the outcome is indisputable. Neanderthals live on in fragments within every modern person descended from populations that left Africa tens of thousands of years ago. The biological implications of this inheritance are far from trivial. Certain Neanderthal genes affect skin pigmentation, hair morphology, and keratin production, shaping how early modern humans adapted to colder climates. Other Neanderthal-derived alleles influence immune responses, particularly in the HLA gene complex, providing defense against Eurasian pathogens. Yet these advantages came at a cost. Some Neanderthal variants are associated with autoimmune disorders, depression, nicotine addiction, and altered responses to pain. In this sense, our inheritance is double-edged. It enriched diversity, but also introduced vulnerabilities that echo into modern disease. The distribution of Neanderthal DNA across our genome tells another story. It is not evenly spread, but concentrated in certain regions, while other areas show a striking absence of Neanderthal sequences. These deserts of Neanderthal DNA suggest negative selection, where interbreeding produced offspring with maladaptive traits that were gradually eliminated. In particular, genes related to testes development and male fertility are underrepresented, pointing to reduced hybrid fitness. This pattern hints at partial reproductive incompatibility, where interbreeding was biologically possible but fraught with challenges. The presence of Neanderthal DNA in Homo sapiens also complicates the narrative of extinction. If genetic absorption occurred, then Neanderthals were not simply replaced, but assimilated at the margins. Small groups may have been swallowed into expanding human populations, their distinct identity erased as their genes diffused. Anthropologist John Hawks has described this as extinction by absorption, a process where disappearance does not mean annihilation, but dissolution into a larger lineage. In this view, Neanderthals persist not as ghosts, but as genetic whispers carried forward in billions of living humans. Yet absorption was not equal exchange. The demographic imbalance between larger human populations and smaller Neanderthal bands meant that gene flow was asymmetrical. Even if interbreeding was frequent, the larger Homo sapiens population diluted Neanderthal DNA across generations, reducing its proportion while preserving fragments. The imbalance of numbers ensured that Neanderthals could contribute to our genome without securing their own long-term survival as a distinct lineage. The psychological and social contexts of these unions remain unknowable, but analogies from anthropology provide unsettling possibilities. Contact zones between human groups often involve complex dynamics of coercion, alliance, and hierarchy. The same may have been true for Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Were these relationships consensual unions forged in cooperation or forced interactions during conflict? The archaeological record remains silent, yet the persistence of Neanderthal DNA confirms that whatever the circumstances, the encounters left enduring marks. These genetic traces also open questions about identity. If Neanderthals were absorbed, what did it mean for them to exist at the boundary between distinct species? Did mixed offspring occupy liminal positions, accepted by one group but not the other? Ethnographic studies of hybrid individuals in contact zones suggest they can act as bridges or outcasts depending on social structures. The fate of early hybrids may have shaped the permeability of boundaries between the species, influencing the degree of gene flow. What is most striking is how easily this genetic inheritance was overlooked until recent decades. For much of modern science, Neanderthals were cast as an extinct other, entirely separate from us. The discovery that every person outside Africa carries their DNA collapses that distance, forcing a reconsideration of what extinction means. Neanderthals are both gone and present, erased as a distinct species, yet living within our cells. Extinction, in this sense, is not a single event, but a spectrum, where disappearance and persistence intertwine. But absorption alone cannot account for their vanishing from the landscapes they once dominated. Genes may survive while populations collapse, and fragments of inheritance cannot mask the reality that the caves and plains they once occupied grew silent. The question shifts again. If interbreeding ensured Neanderthals live on within us, what? Forces erased their independent existence, leaving only genetic shadows in place of living communities? The mingling of populations did not transmit only genes. It also opened channels for pathogens. When species that had long evolved in isolation came into contact, their microbial worlds collided, with consequences as decisive as weapons or climate. In this context, the arrival of Homo sapiens into Neanderthal territories may have carried with it invisible agents of destabilization. Every human population maintains what epidemiologists call a pathogen load, a repertoire of viruses, bacteria, and parasites to which it has developed partial immunity. When isolated groups encounter one another, novel pathogens can move across the boundary with devastating effect. Historical analogies underscore this principle. Smallpox and measles decimated indigenous populations in the Americas after European contact, diseases that had circulated for centuries in Eurasia. The imbalance of immunity made exposure catastrophic. The same logic can be extended deep into prehistory, where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have exchanged pathogens for which the other had no defense. Genetic evidence points toward differential vulnerabilities. Neanderthals had lower genetic diversity in immune-related loci, especially in the major histocompatibility complex, MHC, which coordinates recognition of pathogens. Homo sapiens, by contrast, exhibited broader variation, in part due to larger population sizes and wider ecological ranges. This variation provided a flexible immune repertoire capable of responding to diverse microbial threats. When pathogens crossed from humans to Neanderthals, the limited immune diversity of the latter may have left them disproportionately susceptible. Certain Neanderthal-derived alleles present in modern humans suggest that disease pressure shaped interbreeding itself. Genes associated with toll-like receptors, which detect microbial intruders, show signatures of Neanderthal origin. Their persistence in modern genomes implies that they conferred survival advantages in Eurasian environments. The logic is stark. Interbreeding transmitted not only vulnerabilities, but also adaptive immune traits. Yet the asymmetry of numbers ensured that even if Neanderthals contributed useful variants, they absorbed more risk than protection. For small, scattered bands, a localized epidemic could erase entire communities. The archaeological record cannot display pathogens directly, but indirect evidence hints at their presence. Dental calculus from Neanderthal remains has yielded traces of microbial DNA, including bacteria associated with gum disease and gastrointestinal illness. While these do not prove epidemic events, they suggest chronic exposure to pathogens. Combined with nutritional stress evident in enamel hypoplasias and bone lesions, illness may have compounded other survival pressures. Modern hunter-gatherer studies reveal how even moderate disease burdens can destabilize small groups, reducing fertility and increasing mortality. For Neanderthals, already near demographic thresholds, the impact would have been magnified. The TV dynamics of disease also intersect with mobility. Homo sapiens' larger networks and greater travel distances may have facilitated the spread of pathogens across regions, transforming localized outbreaks into continent-spanning threats. Neanderthals, less mobile and less connected, may have encountered waves of disease carried into their territories by incoming humans. Each wave would have struck populations with limited immunity and no external allies to provide demographic replacement. The psychological dimension of disease should not be overlooked. Illness disrupts social functioning, erodes cooperation, and strains group cohesion. Anthropological records describe how epidemics can provoke fear, scapegoating, and breakdown of trust. In small Neanderthal bands, where survival required coordinated hunting and child-rearing, disease could undermine the very fabric of cooperation. Even without catastrophic mortality, the erosion of trust and the diversion of energy into care and survival could tip fragile populations into decline. Pathogens may also have played a role in shaping interbreeding patterns. If Homo sapiens carried microbes to which Neanderthals had no defense, intimacy between individuals could become a channel of transmission, accelerating mortality in small bands. Conversely, the persistence of certain Neanderthal immune alleles in modern humans suggests that interbreeding also functioned as a form of biological rescue, introducing defenses against Eurasian pathogens. This dual dynamic, vulnerability and adaptation, illustrates how disease weaves into the evolutionary tapestry, at once destructive and generative. The precise pathogens remain speculative, yet candidates emerge from modern analogies. Herpes viruses, papillomaviruses, and respiratory infections spread readily in small groups. Gastrointestinal parasites thrive in populations with close contact to animals, as both humans and Neanderthals had. Zoonotic diseases, transmitted from prey animals to hunters, could have crossed species alongside the exchange of hunting strategies. In each case, the difference lay in demographic resilience. Homo sapiens, with larger and more interconnected populations, could absorb disease shocks. Neanderthals, with fewer numbers, could not. Disease operates invisibly, leaving no spear wound or burned horizon to testify to its role. Yet its fingerprints may be among the most decisive. Extinction can unfold not in battle but in fever, not in confrontation but in weakness that prevents reproduction from outpacing mortality. For Neanderthals, each epidemic would have reduced their already thin margins, compounding vulnerabilities from diet, climate, and competition. The archaeological silence around these events is deceptive, for absence of evidence does not mean absence of impact. And as these microbial currents threaded through contact zones, they did not act alone. Social structures, reproductive strategies, and the capacity to scale cooperation all influenced how species absorbed or succumbed to invisible threats. The interplay of pathogens and populations highlights yet another axis where fragility and resilience diverged, setting the stage for pressures that reached beyond immunity and into the architecture of society itself. The resilience of a species rests not only on biology, but also on the architecture of its social world. For Homo sapiens, larger and more complex groups became both a buffer against risk and a platform for innovation. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence indicates that early modern humans organized themselves in multi-layered structures, with bands forming part of broader clans and regional networks. These arrangements distributed labor, facilitated trade, and allowed for collective responses to crises. In such frameworks, the death of a few hunters did not paralyze subsistence, for roles were distributed and knowledge was redundantly preserved. Neanderthal groups, reconstructed from site densities, genetic data, and habitation patterns, appear to have been smaller and more isolated. Hearth distributions in caves such as El Cidrón in Spain or Vindija in Croatia suggest groups of perhaps 10 to 20 individuals. Genetic sequencing from El Cidrón indicates close kinship ties, consistent with family-level units rather than broader networks. While intimacy may have fostered cohesion, it also limited the scaling of cooperation. With fewer individuals, the division of labor could not diversify to the same extent, leaving bands more vulnerable when key members were lost. The division of labor among Homo sapiens extended beyond hunting and gathering. Archaeological finds of bone needles suggest the manufacture of tailored clothing, an activity requiring dedicated craftsmanship. Evidence of bead production, pigment preparation, and tool specialization points to a society where tasks were differentiated and coordinated. Such specialization fosters efficiency, but also requires mechanisms for sharing output, embedding reciprocity into daily life. Symbolic culture provided those mechanisms, ensuring that specialized contributions were recognized and valued. In this sense, complexity was not accidental, but structurally reinforced. Anthropological studies show that group size is constrained by cognitive capacity, a principle known as Dunbar's number. The neocortex places limits on the number of stable relationships individuals can maintain, estimated at around 150 for humans. Yet symbolic culture, ritual, and language extend this boundary by creating shared frameworks of meaning. Songs, dances, and myths allow groups larger than immediate kin to perceive themselves as a coherent unit. This cognitive extension enabled Homo sapiens to sustain communities that exceeded the limits of face-to-face familiarity. Neanderthals, lacking consistent symbolic scaffolding, may have remained closer to the constraints of direct relationships, keeping group size small. For T, consequences for reproduction were profound. Larger groups provide more mating opportunities, reducing inbreeding and increasing genetic diversity. They also enhance child survival, as communal care buffers against maternal mortality and provides redundancy when parents are lost. Ethnographics, parallels among modern hunter-gatherers show that alloparenting, care by individuals other than the biological parents, is critical in raising offspring. If Homo sapiens engaged more extensively in such practices, their fertility and child survival rates would have outpaced those of Neanderthals. The demographic arithmetic of even slightly higher fertility, when compounded across generations, tilts population trajectories sharply. Social complexity also shapes resilience during crises. In larger groups, surplus labor allows some individuals to focus on exploration, innovation, or ritual, activities that do not directly procure calories, but that generate long-term benefits. Smaller groups, locked in immediate survival, lack this redundancy. Archaeological evidence of musical instruments, such as bone flutes from Swabian Jura, demonstrates that Homo sapiens invested in activities with no direct subsistence value, but immense social significance. Music and ritual forge cohesion, relieve stress, and encode memory. Such practices can stabilize groups under pressure, preventing fracture during scarcity. For Neanderthals, the absence of widespread evidence for such practices suggests that cohesion may have been more fragile in the face of repeated shocks. The neurological dimension of social complexity is reflected in studies of cooperation and cognition. Functional imaging in modern humans shows that tasks involving shared intentionality, planning together, teaching, or coordinating hunts, activate prefrontal networks specialized for mentalizing, the capacity to represent the thoughts of others. Neanderthals likely shared aspects of this ability, as their hunting strategies imply cooperative planning. Yet the sustained reinforcement of these networks through symbolic practices, teaching, and ritualized cooperation may have been less pronounced, limiting their ability to scale complexity across generations. Conflict management further reveals the role of social architecture. Larger groups can absorb disputes by dispersing individuals into subgroups or by invoking shared rituals that resolve tension. Small groups, by contrast, magnify disputes. A quarrel between two hunters can fracture an entire band. The archaeological record hints at interpersonal violence among Neanderthals, but without the social institutions to diffuse conflict, the cost of disputes would have been greater. Homo sapiens, supported by ritual, storytelling, and broader networks, could resolve tensions in ways that preserved group integrity. Even the spatial organization of habitation sites reflects differences in complexity. Early human campsites often display specialized activity zones, areas for butchering, tool production, cooking, and ornament crafting, suggesting an implicit division of space and labor. Neanderthal sites, while containing hearths and tools, show less evidence of spatial differentiation. The organization of space mirrors the organization of society. Where Homo sapiens embedded complexity into daily life, Neanderthals appear to have sustained simpler, more immediate structures. Yet these contrasts cannot be interpreted as deficiencies alone. Neanderthal intimacy within small groups may have fostered bonds of care and empathy. Evidence of long-term survival among injured individuals demonstrates that they supported one another. But intimacy when combined with demographic fragility, could not generate the momentum of complexity. Without scalable structures, they lacked the social surplus to sustain larger networks, to reinforce symbolic systems, or to buffer crises. Through distributed labor, and as competition intensified across Ice Age landscapes, these differences in social scale began to influence reproductive success, survival rates, and resilience. The consequences rippled outward, shaping not just demographic growth, but the rhythm of childhood, the length of dependency, and the strategies by which species prepared for uncertain futures. The structure of social life radiates into the rhythms of reproduction and childhood, and in these domains, the divergence between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens may have been decisive. Small differences in fertility, survival of infants, or the pace of development accumulate across generations, tilting demographic balances in ways that transform entire populations. Skeletal evidence suggests that Neanderthals matured faster than modern humans. Analyses of tooth growth lines, microscopic records of enamel deposition, indicate that Neanderthal children developed adult dentition earlier, suggesting a compressed childhood. The implication is not only biological, but cultural. A shorter childhood reduces the window for extended learning, limiting the time during which children can absorb complex skills, rituals, and symbolic frameworks. For Homo sapiens, prolonged dependency extended opportunities for teaching, embedding cultural transmission into the very fabric of development. Childhood, among modern humans, functions not merely as preparation for adulthood, but as a platform for cumulative culture. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer children show that they spend years acquiring knowledge through imitation, play, and guided participation. Skills as diverse as tool-making, navigation, and ritual performance are scaffolded across a decade or more of apprenticeship. A prolonged childhood allows for redundancy. Mistakes can be made without catastrophic consequence, and knowledge can be rehearsed until mastery is achieved. If Neanderthal childhood was shorter, cultural accumulation may have been constrained, innovations flickering rather than compounding. Fertility rates likewise shape population trajectories. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens may have maintained higher fertility than Neanderthals. Larger group sizes not only allow for more reproductive pairings, but also buffer against child mortality by providing communal care. Alloparenting, where grandparents, siblings, or unrelated individuals help raise children, has been documented across modern human societies and is associated with higher reproductive success. In smaller Neanderthal bands, the capacity for communal child-rearing was more limited, making fertility more vulnerable to fluctuations in adult survival. The survival of infants and mothers also depended on cultural practices surrounding birth. Pelvic morphology in Neanderthals reveals a birth canal shape different from that of modern humans, leading to debates about whether Neanderthal births were more or less difficult. What is clear is that human childbirth, with its unique combination of large-brained infants and narrow pelvises, required social support. Midwifery, assistance during birth, likely emerged early in Homo sapiens, and ethnographic parallels suggest it reduces mortality significantly. If Neanderthals lacked structured birthing assistance, maternal and infant mortality may have been higher, subtly reducing population growth over time. Longevity adds another dimension. The survival of elders is not merely a biological curiosity. It reshapes the transmission of knowledge. In modern hunter-gatherer groups, older individuals serve as repositories of memory, preserving information about landscapes, resources, and rituals. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes's grandmother hypothesis proposes that post-reproductive lifespan in humans evolved because grandmothers contributed to the survival of grandchildren by providing food, care, and knowledge. Fossil records suggest that Neanderthals had shorter lifespans on average, with fewer individuals reaching old age. The absence of elders would have reduced cultural depth, leaving knowledge more vulnerable to loss with each death. Archaeological traces of Neanderthal care for the injured suggest that they valued individuals beyond their immediate subsistence, contribution. Yet the rarity of elderly skeletons points to a demographic structure where the weight of survival fell heavily on younger adults. In such contexts, the death of even a few individuals in their reproductive prime could destabilize group continuity. For Homo sapiens, larger populations with a greater presence of elders could absorb losses while retaining cultural memory. The psychological experience of childhood also differs when lifespans are short and mortality high. In small Neanderthal bands, each child carried immense demographic importance, and survival pressures may have accelerated their integration into adult roles. For Homo sapiens, the extension of childhood fostered experimentation and play, activities that stimulate problem-solving, creativity, and social learning. Play is not trivial. It strengthens neural pathways for cooperation, risk assessment, and innovation. A prolonged period of protected learning may have conferred advantages that extended far beyond childhood itself. The balance of fertility, mortality, and longevity produces cumulative consequences invisible in any single generation. A population with slightly higher child survival, slightly longer lifespans, and slightly more communal care grows exponentially faster than one without those advantages. Over centuries, such differences shift the demographic landscape, allowing one lineage to expand while the other dwindles. For Neanderthals, compressed childhood, smaller group sizes, and limited longevity may have produced demographic fragility, while Homo sapiens, with prolonged childhood and extended social lifespans, accumulated resilience. Yet demographic arithmetic was not insulated from the broader environment. Climatic oscillations, resource fluctuations, and interspecies encounters all intersected with fertility and childhood. Each stress could amplify vulnerabilities, erasing gains or widening disparities. And as environments shifted, the refugees that once sustained Neanderthal groups contracted, forcing them into narrower ecological margins where every child born and every elder lost carried consequences magnified beyond measure. The survival of any population is interwoven with the stability of its habitat, and for Neanderthals, the Ice Age delivered not stability, but relentless fluctuation. The period between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago was punctuated by dramatic climatic swings known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Ice core data from Greenland reveals sudden warming episodes followed by equally abrupt returns to glacial cold. These oscillations destabilized ecosystems with unforgiving speed. Forests retreating into tundra within decades, rivers freezing and thawing, herds altering their migration routes in response to shifting vegetation zones. For species already balanced on thin demographic margins, each swing carried existential weight. Paleo-environmental reconstructions show that Neanderthal territories were squeezed by these climatic pulses. Northern Europe periodically became uninhabitable, forcing populations southward into refugia along the Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. These refuges, while offering relative stability, were limited in size and resources. As Homo sapiens entered the same regions, competition intensified, not only for prey, but for the ecological niches that could support overwintering populations. Archaeological evidence places some of the last Neanderthal groups in Gibraltar and southern Iberia, suggesting that they clung to peripheral strongholds as their broader range contracted. The stress of repeated displacement left signatures in the archaeological record. At sites like Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, layers of Mousterian tools persist longer than elsewhere, indicating a late survival pocket. Yet even here, the encroachment of changing climates and incoming humans pressed against the limits of endurance. Pollen analysis from the Iberian Peninsula demonstrates vegetation shifts from woodlands to steppe, reducing the diversity of available plant foods and altering the distribution of prey. In such contracted ecosystems, every fluctuation in rainfall or temperature could ripple into famine. For Neanderthals, whose hunting strategies centered on large game, the reduction of megafauna was especially crippling, as reindeer and aurochs migrated unpredictably or vanished from local landscapes. Neanderthals faced scarcity that their narrower subsistence strategies could not easily offset. By contrast, Homo sapiens exploited fish, shellfish, birds, and small mammals, filling ecological niches left empty by retreating herds. The archaeological record in coastal Iberia reveals human use of marine resources at precisely the time Neanderthals were retreating into the same marginal zones. The asymmetry in dietary breadth may have determined which groups endured when refuges contracted. Climatic instability also imposed psychological burdens. Anthropological studies of small-scale societies highlight the anxiety generated by unpredictable environments, where traditional knowledge of seasonal cycles becomes unreliable. For Neanderthals, whose knowledge was deeply rooted in local ecology, rapid and repeated disruptions may have undermined trust in inherited strategies. The erosion of ecological predictability weakens cultural transmission, destabilizing the continuity of survival practices. Homo sapiens, with broader networks and symbolic systems, could reinterpret disruption through ritual, myth, and experimentation, transforming unpredictability into shared meaning. Genetic evidence reinforces the picture of demographic contraction. Analysis of Neanderthal genomes suggest severe population bottlenecks in their final millennia, with effective population sizes shrinking to levels comparable to endangered species today. These bottlenecks magnified inbreeding, reducing genetic resilience precisely when flexibility was most needed. In fragmented refuges, isolation deepened the problem, each group cut off from others by expanding glaciers and barren steppes. Where Homo sapiens could migrate and reconnect, Neanderthal populations were trapped in shrinking ecological islands. Archaeologists studying the Caucasus find similar patterns of late survival followed by abrupt disappearance. Sites in the foothills reveal Mousterian artifacts dated close to 40,000 years ago. Yet shortly afterward, the record shifts entirely to human-made blade technologies. The transition is stark, suggesting not gradual blending, but replacement in landscapes where climate left no room for redundancy. The last Neanderthal refuges were not secure sanctuaries, but precarious margins, where survival was measured in decades rather than centuries. Even in these refuges, traces of symbolic activity appear, hinting at attempts to sustain cultural identity under pressure. In Iberia, evidence of pigment use and possible engravings coincides with the twilight of Neanderthal presence. Such acts may represent resistance to erasure, moments of meaning-making in the face of contraction. Yet, symbols alone could not reverse demographic decline when prey diminished and climates hardened. Survival required not only meaning but resilience in numbers, a resilience that climate collapse steadily eroded. The contraction of habitat did not unfold in silence. For each valley abandoned, each refuge lost, stories would have lingered in a memory of herds that no longer returned, of winters that arrived too soon, of landscapes transformed beyond recognition. These stories, unrecorded but carried in the lives of the last Neanderthal bands, mark the weight of climate not as an abstract force, but as lived experience of dislocation and loss. And as refuges narrowed to their final limits, the survival of Neanderthals hinged on margins so narrow that a single failed season, a single epidemic, or a single conflict could erase entire groups. What remained was not a continent of thriving bands, but scattered enclaves clinging to existence, where survival itself became a precarious gamble with each passing year. The disappearance of Neanderthals cannot be attributed only to deterministic forces of climate, demography, or competition. Evolutionary history is shaped as much by chance as by necessity, by contingencies that redirect trajectories in ways disproportionate to their scale. In this light, the fate of Neanderthals may have been sealed not by a single overarching weakness, but by the accumulation of accidents, the convergence of unlucky timings, and the cascading effects of chance events. Paleogenetic. Studies emphasize how small populations are particularly vulnerable to stochastic pressures. Random fluctuations in birth and death rates can cause dramatic shifts in demographic stability when numbers are low. For Neanderthals, scattered into isolated groups, the loss of only a few individuals could push a band below viable thresholds. In such contexts, chance events, an epidemic introduced by a single encounter, an accident during a dangerous hunt, an especially harsh winter, could erase entire communities. In larger human populations, the same events would have been absorbed, buffered by redundancy and scale. The archaeological record reveals no sudden catastrophe across the continent, no volcanic eruption or asteroid impact that explains their disappearance. Yet smaller regional calamities may have tipped the balance. The eruption of the Campanian ignimbrite supervolcano in southern Italy around 39,000 years ago blanketed Europe with ash and altered climate patterns. While modern humans survived this event, its impact on already diminished Neanderthal populations in southern Europe could have been devastating. Whether through crop failures in plant communities, disruption of prey herds, or respiratory stress from ash inhalation, local consequences may have erased groups already weakened by other pressures. Contingency also manifests in the timing of migrations. Had Homo sapiens entered Europe earlier, before climatic volatility peaked, the competition might have unfolded differently. Had they arrived later, after another millennia of Neanderthal adaptation, the demographic balance might have shifted. Instead, the overlap occurred during one of the most unstable climatic intervals of the late Pleistocene. That convergence, two species meeting during a period of environmental upheaval, was not inevitable but contingent on migration timing and climatic oscillation. Even cultural innovations, often treated as deterministic advantages, depend on chance for their dissemination. A new hunting technique, symbolic practice, or technological refinement may emerge in a single group. Whether it spreads depends on fragile circumstances, whether the innovator survives, whether the group interacts with others, whether conditions make the practice visibly advantageous. In small Neanderthal populations, chance failures of transmission may have erased promising ideas before they could take hold. For modern humans, larger and more interconnected groups increase the odds of survival and diffusion. But even here, the preservation of culture was subject to contingency. Anthropological parallels highlight how chance shapes survival in small groups. In Arctic hunter-gatherer societies, the accidental death of skilled hunters can collapse food security. In rainforest communities, a sudden epidemic can extinguish entire lineages. The same principles extend backward into prehistory. Neanderthal bands, though skilled and resilient, lived in contexts where survival often balanced on knife-edge probabilities. Over time, the law of small numbers dictated that enough bands would vanish to erode the species' viability across its range. Chance also operates in interactions between species. Genetic evidence shows that interbreeding occurred, yet the degree of absorption depended on unpredictable circumstances of contact. A few successful hybrid lineages could diffuse Neanderthal DNA into Homo sapiens populations, while failed hybrids or isolated unions left no trace. The uneven survival of these lineages demonstrates how much evolutionary legacy can hinge on coincidence, who met whom, under what conditions, and with what outcomes. The interplay of contingency and perception must also be considered. In environments of volatility, human cognition evolved to detect patterns, sometimes real, sometimes illusory. The capacity to attribute meaning to coincidence may have influenced how groups responded to chance events. Rituals, myths, and symbolic practices could transform random misfortune into structured narratives, sustaining cohesion in the face of uncertainty. Neanderthals' symbolic traces suggest they may have had similar practices, but the archaeological silence about their persistence raises the question of whether their narratives were fragile, dissolving when groups dissolved, while Homo sapiens embedded theirs in wider networks that allowed continuity. What remains most haunting is how little separates extinction from persistence when chance intervenes. Had a few Neanderthal bands survived climatic swings, interbred more widely, or avoided regional catastrophes, their presence might have endured into later millennia. The evolutionary record contains many examples of near misses, lineages that survived through fortuitous escapes from disasters or through the survival of one remnant population. That Neanderthals did not achieve such escape may not reflect inevitable decline, but the absence of precisely those strokes of luck that sometimes decide survival. Chance does not operate in isolation. It interacts with vulnerability. For a robust species, accidents are absorbed, their consequences smoothed across numbers and networks. For fragile species, accidents cascade, compounding weakness until survival becomes improbable. Neanderthals, fragmented and diminished, lived in a world where each misfortune resonated more deeply, each contingency weighted more heavily. And as those contingencies accumulated, the line between persistence and disappearance grew thinner, until even minor events could tip the balance beyond recovery. Yet chance also shaped what followed, for their disappearance did not erase their presence entirely. Genes, ideas, and cultural echoes crossed into Homo sapiens, carried forward not by deterministic necessity, but by the unpredictable encounters of individuals in landscapes of uncertainty. These traces remind us that contingency not only extinguishes, but also transforms, redirecting lineages in ways no single pattern of adaptation can fully predict. And beyond the reach of chance lay the consequences of disappearance itself, reverberating into the trajectory of the species that remained, reshaping identity, inheritance, and the meaning of survival. The disappearance of Neanderthals altered not only the landscapes they once inhabited, but the trajectory of the species that remained. Their absence created ecological and cultural vacancies that Homo sapiens filled, shaping the way human societies evolved. Yet, they did not vanish entirely. The fragments of their DNA, still present in billions of people today, testified to an inheritance that is not metaphorical but biological, shaping traits as intimate as our immune responses and as visible as the structure of our skin and hair. Extinction, in this light, is never absolute. It lingers in genetic mosaics and in the evolutionary possibilities those mosaics create. Among the most striking legacies is immunity. Neanderthal-derived alleles continue to influence how modern humans respond to pathogens. Some provide protection against viruses and bacteria, improving detection of microbial intruders. Others increase the risk of autoimmune disorders where the immune system turns against its own tissues. The persistence of both benefits and liabilities illustrates the trade-offs of evolution. What enhanced survival in the Paleolithic may complicate health in the modern world, where medicine extends lifespans and changes the context in which genes operate. In this way, Neanderthal inheritance continues to act within us, long after their communities disappeared from the Earth. Metabolism provides another thread. Variants inherited from Neanderthals affect fat storage, insulin regulation, and lipid metabolism. In Ice Age environments, such traits may have aided survival by conserving energy during scarcity. In contemporary societies of abundance, they may predispose to obesity and diabetes. The mismatch between past utility and present cost underscores how evolutionary legacies are not static. They interact with environments across time, producing outcomes no ancestor could have anticipated. Even neurological traits may carry echoes. Certain Neanderthal alleles have been linked to mood disorders, sleep regulation, and sensitivity to pain. Whether these variants once conferred adaptive advantages, perhaps by modulating alertness, vigilance, or social bonding in harsh climates, remains under investigation. What is clear is that the cognitive and emotional lives of modern humans carry subtle imprints of Neanderthal heritage, refracted through the vastly different contexts of modern existence. Beyond biology lies the question of culture. The discovery of symbolic artifacts at Neanderthal sites, pigmented shells, possible engravings, and organized burials continues to challenge the boundary once drawn between us and them. Their traces remind us that symbolic thought, empathy, and care for the dead were not the exclusive property of Homo sapiens. The disappearance of Neanderthals deprived the world of a lineage that might have developed its own symbolic traditions, further producing parallel cultures with trajectories unknowable to us. Their absence simplified the human story into a single dominant branch, but it also narrowed the diversity of perspectives that could have emerged. The psychological resonance of their disappearance reaches into myth and imagination. Throughout history, cultures have told stories of beings both human and other. Giants, wild men, forest dwellers, creatures that resemble us but are not us. Some anthropologists suggest that such myths may echo deep memories of encounters with other human species, including Neanderthals. Whether or not such memories persisted consciously, the presence of another humanity so close to our own leaves a haunting impression, an awareness that we were not always alone. The legacy also carries an ethical dimension. The study of Neanderthals forces us to confront the fragility of human lineages and the contingencies that decide survival. Their disappearance reminds us that being human has never guaranteed persistence. Our own species once teetered on the edge of extinction, reduced to small populations in Africa during climatic crises. The difference between survival and disappearance lay not only in adaptation, but in chance, timing, and the accumulation of advantages that need not have been decisive in themselves. Their fate becomes a mirror, reflecting the precariousness of our own. The presence of their DNA in us complicates the notion of extinction itself. Neanderthals are both absent and present, both gone as a distinct people and alive as fragments within our bodies. This duality unsettles the boundary between survival and disappearance. Extinction, viewed this way, is not a single moment, but a process, one that can dissolve identity while preserving traces. It raises questions about what it means for a species to live on, whether survival requires continuity of culture, continuity of genes, or continuity of identity. The legacy of their disappearance also alters how we imagine human uniqueness. If Neanderthals shared empathy, care, symbolic behavior, and interbreeding with us, then the traits we claim as distinctively human are revealed as more widely distributed across the genus Homo. Their absence did not erase these traits, but it did concentrate them within one surviving lineage. Our sense of exceptionalism rests in part on their disappearance, a disappearance that may have been contingent rather than inevitable. The question that lingers is not only why they disappeared, but what the world would be if they had not. Had Neanderthals persisted alongside us, the history of humanity would not have been singular but plural, shaped by interactions between two cultures with overlapping yet distinct cognitive and symbolic worlds. Our philosophies, religions, and sciences might have been refracted through the presence of another humanity, forcing us to define ourselves not against animals, but against kin who were nearly us. Their absence foreclosed that possibility, leaving us to imagine what was lost. And as science continues to uncover their traces, in genomes, in bones, in pigments rubbed into shells, their disappearance presses against the boundaries of what we mean by survival, raising the unsettling possibility that our own endurance may be just as contingent, our own story just as precariously balanced on the edge of climate, chance, and the unseen mathematics of survival.